So hopefully this will turn out. But we want to talk about, I was talking last week about doing our washes, the wet on the dry, the wet on wet, and dry on dry, which are probably the three most prominent types of painting that you will do in watercolor. So I thought we'd do it in a more fun way. I saw this artist, I think about a year ago. She was showing how she was doing very quick little flowers and whatnot. And I thought, that would be a really great way to, a more fun way to show my students how to do the washes. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to get our smaller, we're just going to work with our smaller brushes. Right now I got a number 2, so I think what I've got, you guys have got is a number 4, unless in the class tomorrow, or in the class, sorry, I'll provide you with a smaller brush. So the first one we're going to do is a wet on dry. That is probably 90% of what most watercolorists do, is a wet onto a dry. Some of the benefits of wet on dry is workability. You can come back in and play with it. And or build up on it, so you can do glazing and things like that, and you've got a lot more control. So one of the really quick ways to go about this is, I'm just going to use red because I think that's going to probably pop up better on the video. And just to start, we're going to do we're just going to do like a little simple, looks more like an anemone, basic little 5-petaled flower. Okay. And really great way to get that started until you become more comfortable with, in your tools and things like that. And then there'll be other ways that you can create flowers. But what a fun way this is, and I really like it for doing warm-ups and things like that. Okay, so we're gonna start with build up, a nice little bit of pigment on your brush. You wet your brush thoroughly and put some, you've got some water. If you're working with right out of the tube, then you don't have to really work too hard to get the pigment on there. Otherwise, if you're working from a pan, you want to make sure you've got that wetted out, and then we start. So I've got a good amount of paint on the brush. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to actually just make 3, I'm going to start with 3 little dots, just like this. Yes, we are going to end up, well, you know what, let's just do 3 first, okay? So I'm going to just start with that. I'm going to take the excess off, clean my brush, right? And then put it in the clean water and come back and just dab off. And now what we're going to do, so we've got those 3 dots. This is very wet. It's got lots of water on there. And then we're just going to kind of come in and make our petal like this. And do some wiggling with it, so then you can kind of get that nice petal shape. And then I'll dab it here, and that encourages the paint to travel where the water is, the pigment. So I'm going to come around again. I could, at this point, go back in and get more water, but I'm using my natural hair. So we'll be using the synthetic, so you'll probably have to re-wet. But the natural hairs hold water for a long time. And I probably can come back and even do it here too. We'll see. Nope, see, it's a little bit dry, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. Here we come. See that? So this one here is a lot richer. And so, and you turn your page, and that way I find it more comfortable to pull my petals out rather than, kind of do a push away. It's easier to pull towards you. And then this is, see here, I can kind of come in and play around with these petals while it's still wet. And it's only going to go where I put my brush, right? And you'll see the difference in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to come in and we're going to do another one here. I did this a little bit high on there, but that's okay. I'll just make like the petals coming off the page. So we're going to do a 5-petal. Clean out that. Come in with some clean water. Right. There we are. Make sure I get in the camera here. And that's okay if you go into that other one. Makes it a little more realistic too. See, so you just kind of wiggle it too, because it gives it more of a natural look. And there. So this one's quite pale compared to this here, but how you would work this now, this is the beauty of the wet on dries. I come in with a clean brush. I got the extra pigment out and I put some water in it, and I took the water out, and I'm coming in with a thirsty brush. Thirsty brush means that you've taken all the water out. And you're soaking up any excess pigment. So what we can do here is we can just kind of come around. If you want to add. So typically with a flower, right, there's going to be a little bit of white. It's going to be fairly, well, it depends. Depends on the flower. But in this instance here, we're going to make the body of it fairly white. And then we've got the... So I'm going to take an off color here, maybe a purple. And I'm going to dab that in the center. Just in the centers here. See, I kind of went off a little bit there too. Isn't that pretty? It's really a lovely little warm up. So, and this would be your wet on your dry. And so I cleaned that out. I came back in with some clean water and I'm dabbing it out. So you can add a little bit, you know, just touch it around a little bit, just to add some color on the outside here. And there you have it. Right? There's a wet on dry. So to do the wet on wet, it's a little bit different. So what we want to do is coming in a little bit blind, but you tilt your head to one side so you can see the surface of your paper when it's wet. And so I'm going to kind of come in, and same thing as I'm going to bring my brush down, and it's nice clean water, and I'm going to do the shape of a petal on the surface, really wet that out, kind of come back in again, do another one. So I've got my head tilted to the side and I can see. And so I'm going to turn around. I put a little, I don't know if you can see it, I left a little bit of the color in the water just so it would stand out a little bit. So I'm just going to continue. Oh, darn it. Okay, let's start over. I got a little bit too much in that. Okay, so let's, I'm going to put a petal this right here. Work quickly. We want to make sure it's wet on wet. So the base is wet and we're going to come in with the wet. So I'm going to come around here, make my petals. So, and I got some little puddles there, but it's not going anywhere where I didn't put water. These tend to be a little more organic. This is more controlled. So there's the wet on wet. I don't know if you could see the paper, whether you could see the wetness. Now we're going to drop. Third time's a charm. I went and redid it again because the two were off the camera a little bit. So I'm hand holding it right now. So I'm going to try and do this wet on wet for you. I have my water a little bit tinted just so that it will show up. So the wet on wet, the whole premise behind this is to saturate the surface of the paper. So you can see I've got a little bit of a tint to the water, and that's just so it shows up on the screen for you, because sometimes that won't translate. So I'm coming back in and I'm just going to, you know, same thing, going to do a little wiggly and get these petals, get the surface wet. Right, I'm just going to come out. I split that out. So I'm, like I said, it's always easier to pull towards you than it is away from you. You tend to split your you know, your brush hairs. So you can see I got a couple of drops there, so you want to stay away from those. Otherwise that'll take the shape of your So I'm trying to work really quickly here so that I can get this done and ready. So you can see I did, instead of tipping off my water off to the side, I dripped it onto the paper. So I'm just going to soak that up a little bit there. So you can see I've got the 5 petal. So now I'm going to go in and I'm just going to make sure that that's very wet, right? And so you take a look at the surface of the paper and you can see where I got that, see that puddle there where that's moving? You can see that that's very wet. Now some are a little wetter than the others. If it doesn't spread out, that means that one is not as wet. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take my full pigment now and and it's wet. Like I've taken it right. You see how wet that is? You can actually take that to the side to your palette and make a puddle there, which probably would be a lot easier to do with our palettes because we have it. That's probably what we'll do. So then just kind of come in and just drop the paint. See, that's not spreading as quickly as I'd hoped right now, only because the paper had a chance to dry while I was showing you. So I'm just going to drop some more water in here just to kind of encourage this. So really what we're doing, instead of pulling, we're just allowing the pigment to flow in, in their own little ponds, so to speak, right? That's, like I said before, it's okay if they touch each other and migrate into one another. Just makes it look a little more organic. So and then you just allow that to flow. And that's going to move for a while. Typically you don't use a wet on wet with flowers. Some do. Like some will work very wet. You'll see some artists with big brushes and they'll wet their paper. But typically wet on wet is where you completely wet the entire paper. And then you come in with your colors and you do your washes in that way. You don't always see it happening on individual, like floral or anything like that. However, there are, there are. People do it. Now, I find that doing it this way, it does look a little bit more organic. So you can tip this, just to get the pigment to flow. See that? It's not going to go where there's no water. Right? You can see I got that little puddle, so that one's really wet. And so the nice thing with this, though, one of the cool things is this will continue to settle. You just leave that, and it will continue to migrate out. Sometimes some will be a little faster. You could tease it a little bit. You know what's a lot of fun, too, is making puddles and dropping your liquid paint in and just watch it flow. Okay. So, and I'm just kind of helping it. I'm not pushing. I'm not putting any pressure on it. I'm very light on the surface. So get all the excess water out when you do that too. So I'm just coming in a little bit with a thirsty brush because this one really had a big puddle. Not that it matters because it is a wet on wet. But, I'm just lightly on the surface, just teasing that. Now what I want to do, like typically flowers tend to be a little darker on the inside, right? Where they come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in with one of my darker pigments here. Maybe this one. I think that might be indigo. And I'm just going to drop. So, just be very organic and very loose and just leave it. And you'll watch after a few minutes that will all migrate through until you get like a finish more like that. It's kind of cool, eh? So the thing with wet on wet is it, as I show you here, it's got a very soft organic edge to it. You can soften those even more after it's dry by going in with a very clean wet brush, just kind of what we call a smuggling or smudging or whatever, scrumbling I call it. And I think most our other watercolors call it scrumbling. But see, even here, if you wanted to have it a little bit more consistent with the others, just come in with a thirsty brush and lift up. Just tease. And then, so that's going to continue to work its little wonders. So you can see this brush here. You can lift up if you want the others to remain the same. Just kind of come in. I'm doing this one-handed while I'm holding the camera. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so that's wet on dry, wet on wet. And dry on dry means I'm just going to come straight from the tube. It's full pigment. And I'm just going to kind of, look at that, like huge difference, right? So it's very, very strong. Right? I'm not a fan of this, only because the only time that I come in on a dry on dry is typically if it's, so you see there's not, it's almost like a flat wash, the dry on dry. And so I've got water in its tube consistency, right? And tube consistency means full on pigment, and you're coming right onto the page. So you can see how really super dark that is. Now, to me, this is fine if I was building up. Now, if I did this with yellows, so let's do this a dry on dry with a yellow. So dry on dry again is coming straight out from a tube, right? Basically no water, not a lot of water, just very little water just to get some spreadability to your pigment. And then you come in. So let's do this yellow. And watercolor, remember, is always the lightest to the darkest when you're building colors, right? Or building a painting. So you see also too where it got a little dry again. We were seeing those dry marks. We'll do that when we do the techniques. You'll see that. All right, so then we've got our yellow. So you see how it's just almost like a flat wash. It's just a non-variegated, very even, very even color. And when it comes to flowers, that's really not the way they are. Now you've got the odd tropical flowers, but even when you look at them very closely, you'll see. So now what we can do with this is we can come in with another dry, like maybe a little darker, and kind of come in. Oops, hang on. I didn't have enough on there. So as I said before, typically with my pan paints, which were squeezed from a tube and put into the pans, and then I reanimate them or I re-wet them and let them sit for a bit, so then they become like tube consistency again. So here I am coming over top with tube consistency paint with a little bit darker yellow. This is a warmer yellow. I started off with the cooler, which I don't typically use a cool yellow and then a warm yellow on top. I will stay within the ranges of the colors depending on if I want depth or what have you. A lot of times when you mix cools with warms, you'll get more of a dark muddy, like almost a muddy color. However, yellows are very forgiving, and they tend, because yellows are such a light color anyway, they tend to be a lot more forgiving. So, and then again, I'll show you, I'll add a third color, and I'll actually do an orange, and I'll just drop that in. But you can see it's very hard, and it's got almost like a acrylic or an opaque kind of a touch to it. So, and then you can come in and just do whatever. But this is almost like coming in like, what was I going to liken it to? Almost like a coloring book, right? So it's very rich, very pure. But to me, I very seldom use the dry on dry. The only time I do that, it's like everything's got its place, and so see here now what I did is I actually cleaned off my brush, right? Got some totally clean water, took all the excess water out, and now I'm just using my brush as a blender, right? And then you can just blend that out. So, I mean, that's something that works, right? And as you work it, it's like you get a blender in pencil crayons, those blender pens, in markers and things like that as well. So this would be the same type of an effect. So there you have it. We have a wet on dry, a wet on wet, and a dry on dry. So all three have their benefits. So this one here I could come in after though, and I could actually just lift out. But why bother even putting all that pigment down to begin with, right? If you're going to just lift it all out, you're better to do something like this. Okay? Have fun.